Imagine sitting in the dentist's chair, the bright overhead light blinding, the sound of metal tools clinking together just inches from your face. A routine visit, nothing unusual, just another day in the hands of a trusted professional. The man in the white coat, the one carefully adjusting his gloves, the one who flashes that reassuring smile, has spent years perfecting his craft. His patients trust him, his colleagues respect him, and his community sees him as a model citizen. He is a healer, a provider, a man dedicated to his work. But outside of this sterile, fluorescent-lit office, beyond the neatly organized trays and rows of dental instruments, there was another side to him. A side few had seen, and even fewer lived to talk about. Because behind those surgical masks and gentle reassurances was a mind meticulously plotting, hands that had held not only dental drills but also weapons, and a heart that had long since turned cold. His wasn't a life shaped by rage, nor was it one defined by the impulsive violence of an unhinged mind. No, his actions were controlled, deliberate, each move calculated with the precision of a surgeon, every decision made with one clear goal, wealth. He didn't just crave money, he saw it as the ultimate measure of power, the one thing worth everything. And to get it, there was nothing he wouldn't do. The first time, it was almost too easy. A sudden accident, a tragedy that no one questioned. A grieving widow, a life insurance payout. No reason for suspicion. No reason to look deeper. But as the years passed, the deaths continued, each one bringing more money, more confidence. More arrogance. A pattern so subtle, so carefully designed, that it took decades to unravel. Friends. Business partners. Even lovers. He charmed them, used them, disposed of them. And each time, he walked away clean, his reputation untouched. Each funeral was just another chapter in his growing fortune, another success in a game only he knew he was playing. Until, finally, someone started asking questions. Because secrets don't stay buried forever. Welcome to our channel. If you're captivated by true crime stories that expose the darkness hidden in plain sight, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Tonight, we uncover the shocking story of a man who used his skills not to heal, but to destroy. A man whose ambition knew no limits. This is the true story of fatal extraction. He wasn't the kind of man you'd expect to be at the center of a murder investigation. A dentist with years of experience, a well-known figure in his community, the type of person who shook hands at church, waved to neighbors, and sent polite Christmas cards. His patients never questioned his steady hands, never saw anything unusual in the way he worked, the way he spoke. To them, he was just Dr. Glennon Engleman, a man who fixed teeth, a man who smiled easily, a man who seemed to be exactly who he claimed to be. But behind closed doors, behind that professional mask, he was something else entirely. He had no interest in simply making a living, no desire to settle for the comfortable life that came with an honest career. Money, for him, wasn't just about security, it was about control, about power. And working long hours, treating patients, collecting fees? That was too slow. He wanted more, and he wanted it fast. He wasn't the kind of man to wait. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Small hustles, little manipulations, bending the rules here and there to get ahead. But small wasn't enough. Not for him. Because Glennon Engleman had discovered something far more profitable than dentistry. Something that didn't require years of hard work or late nights in the office. Something that, if done right, could make him rich in ways his profession never could. Murder. It started with an idea. A simple one. What if an unfortunate accident led to a life insurance payout? What if that payout could be planned, controlled? What if he could be the one pulling the strings, making sure the money ended up exactly where he wanted it? He was smart. He had spent years perfecting that role, making sure that no one would ever suspect what lay beneath. Because the man his patients saw, the man his colleagues respected, was not the real Engleman. The real Engleman was something else entirely. He wasn't just a dentist. He was a man who saw people as opportunities, as means to an end. He was charming when he needed to be, ruthless when he had to be, and always thinking about the next move. Every handshake, every conversation, every relationship was a step towards something bigger. To those who knew him on the surface, he was a hard-working professional, a man with ambition. But to those who got too close, those who unknowingly became pieces in his twisted game, he was something far worse. His victims were people who trusted him. Business partners who thought they were working toward a shared goal. Men who believed they were his friends. Engleman's skill wasn't just in killing, it was in making sure no one connected the dots, in making sure the grief and confusion kept people from seeing the truth. He thrived in the shadows, controlling the game without ever letting anyone know they were playing. But shadows don't last forever. There were detectives who never stopped asking questions, officers who started seeing patterns where others saw coincidence. A widow who couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A family member who refused to accept the official story. And as the years passed, as the bodies piled up, the puzzle pieces started to fall into place. What once seemed like unrelated tragedies began to form a picture of a man who had spent decades turning death into profit. And for the first time in his life, Glennon Engleman was no longer in control. Dr. Glennon Engleman never killed out of rage. He never acted on impulse. Every death was calculated, every move planned. He spent years refining his methods, learning how to make murder look like misfortune. He was patient, meticulous, and utterly without conscience. If a life insurance payout took years to mature, he waited. If a business partner wasn't quite ready to be eliminated, he played the long game. And when the time was right, when there was nothing left to gain from keeping them alive, he ended their lives without hesitation. The first known victim was James Bullock, a man who had once trusted Engleman. He had no reason to suspect that his wife's former employer, the friendly dentist, had any ill intentions. But Engleman had helped orchestrate Bullock's marriage to his young wife for one reason only: money. The life insurance policy was in place, and Engleman had already decided how it would end. One night in 1958, Bullock was shot in the head. The crime had no apparent motive. No robbery. No known enemies. Just a man gunned down in what appeared to be a random act of violence. But there was nothing random about it. It was the first in a series of murders that spanned decades, each one fueling Engleman's greed. Years later, Peter Halm became another pawn in Engleman's scheme. A young man, newly married, building a life with a woman he loved. What he didn't know was that his wife was already under Engleman's influence. Engleman had helped guide the relationship, played the role of a mentor, an older, wiser figure. And when the time came, when the money was right, he made sure Peter Halm wouldn't live to see another day. The explosion that killed him was carefully set up, an industrial accident, a tragic but believable end. His widow collected the insurance money. And Engleman? He got his cut. But Engleman wasn't satisfied with just killing for insurance money. He saw opportunities everywhere. In business, in partnerships, in anyone who had something he wanted. He invested in ventures, formed alliances, and when they were no longer useful, he eliminated his associates. Sometimes it was a gunshot. Sometimes an explosion. Sometimes he hired others to carry out the job. And always, he made sure it looked like something else, an accident, a robbery, an unfortunate event. Arthur and Ron Goosewell, a father and son, became his next targets. They had trusted Engleman in business, never realizing they were walking into a trap. He had gained their trust, convinced them of their shared financial future. But when Engleman saw a way to take what they had without splitting it, he made his move. The Goosewells were ambushed, shot and left for dead. Another tragic event. Another case that would remain unsolved for years. And the list continued. Victims who had no idea they were part of a deadly game. Friends, acquaintances, business partners, even the husbands of women Engleman seduced and manipulated. He was careful, ruthless, and always thinking ahead. He convinced those around him to trust him, to believe in his plans, to see him as a man of success and ambition. And when they had outlived their usefulness, when there was no more money to be made, he made sure they didn't live to tell the story. The community was shaken each time one of these deaths occurred. Friends mourned, families grieved, businesses closed. But no one ever suspected the dentist. He was there in the background, offering condolences, moving on with his life as if nothing had happened. Because to him, nothing had. It was just business. Another transaction. Another step toward the wealth and power he believed he deserved. But with each carefully planned murder, with each insurance claim, with each new victim, Engleman left behind something he never intended to: evidence. Small details that, on their own, meant nothing. A pattern that no one had seen yet. A thread waiting to be pulled. And as the years passed, as the body count rose, as the investigations stretched across states, that thread was about to be unraveled. It started with whispers. Private suspicions. Detectives working separate cases, in different cities, different years, started noticing the same strange coincidences. A sudden death. A large insurance payout. A business partner gone without warning. A grieving widow receiving a financial windfall. And somehow, the same name kept surfacing, not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as a quiet figure in the background. A dentist. A man who seemed to be connected to people who met tragic, untimely ends. It wasn't enough to build a case. Not yet. But it was enough to make people look closer. For years, these deaths had been considered isolated incidents. A shooting in a dark alley. An industrial explosion. A fatal ambush. Investigators had no reason to connect them. Until one man changed everything. Robert Handy, a former associate, had once been part of Engleman's world. He knew things. He had seen things. And most importantly, he had been involved. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the pressure of law enforcement closing in, Handy decided to talk. What he revealed was something investigators hadn't even imagined: a man who didn't just kill for money, but who planned murders with the precision of a chess player, setting up his victims years in advance, orchestrating their deaths like a business transaction. Handy didn't just give them information. He gave them a roadmap. Names. Places. The financial arrangements that followed each murder. Investigators went back to old case files, comparing notes, revisiting crime scenes, questioning witnesses who had long since moved on. They began to piece together a timeline, a method, a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for decades. What they found was shocking. Victims who had nothing in common, different professions, different backgrounds, different cities, were all tied together by one thread: Engleman. The man who always seemed to be connected but never close enough to draw suspicion. The man who played the long game, manipulating people like chess pieces, waiting for the right moment to strike. But knowing the truth and proving it were two different things. Engleman had never left obvious evidence. He didn't use his own hands unless he had to. He involved others: lovers, business partners, hired killers, people who carried out his plans while he remained in the shadows. The crimes were spread out over decades, over multiple states, with different law enforcement agencies handling each case separately. A conviction would require more than suspicion. It would require hard proof. The forensic teams went back through evidence, this time knowing what they were looking for. Ballistics reports were re-examined, financial records traced, old crime scene photographs studied for connections no one had noticed before. Witness statements that had once seemed unrelated were compared, revealing inconsistencies, moments where stories didn't quite match up. And then, there was the money. Life insurance policies, business dealings, real estate transfers. All leading back to Engleman. Financial records showed an unmistakable pattern: every time someone close to him died, he either received a direct payment or benefited through someone else. What had once seemed like coincidence was now undeniable. The final breakthrough came when investigators found those willing to testify. Associates who had once feared Engleman, women who had once been under his control, people who had seen his manipulation firsthand. Some had played a role in his schemes, helping him secure insurance payouts, covering his tracks. But now, faced with mounting evidence and the threat of prison themselves, they were ready to talk. The investigation was no longer just about solving murders. It was about exposing a man who had built an entire life on deception, a man who had played with human lives as if they were nothing more than pieces on a board. The pieces were finally falling into place. And for Glennon Engleman, time was running out. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, families of victims, former patients, and curious onlookers all sat in silence as the man who had hidden behind a white coat and a charming smile for decades finally faced judgment. The evidence was undeniable. Witnesses testified one after another, recounting stories of manipulation, fear, and death. Associates who had once been his allies now pointed directly at him, detailing how he had convinced them to assist in his deadly schemes. Handwritten notes, financial records, and forensic reports all painted the same picture: a man who had turned murder into a calculated business plan. Engleman sat quietly as the prosecution laid out its case. He had always been careful, always stayed one step ahead, but this time, there was nowhere left to run. The sheer number of crimes, the long paper trail of insurance payouts, the testimonies from those he had used and discarded, it all built a case so solid that even his defense team struggled to find a way to cast doubt. He showed little emotion as former lovers described how he had charmed them, only to draw them into his deadly plots. He barely reacted when forensic experts explained how they had re-examined crime scenes, connecting his methods to murders that had once seemed unrelated. But the families of his victims felt every word. For them, this trial wasn't just about proving his guilt. It was about finally giving names and faces to those he had taken, about making sure the world knew they weren't just numbers on an insurance policy. Some had waited years, decades, for this moment. They listened as detectives recounted the long, exhausting investigation, the years of piecing together a puzzle that had been carefully designed to remain unsolved. The verdict was inevitable. The jury didn't need long to deliberate. When they returned, the courtroom was silent as the judge read the words that would seal Engleman's fate. Guilty. On multiple counts of first-degree murder. Sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He would never see the outside world again. The man who had spent years profiting from death would now spend the rest of his own life in a concrete cell. For some, there was relief. For others, there was no real closure. Money couldn't bring back those who were gone. Justice couldn't erase the years of grief and unanswered questions. But at least now, Engleman could never manipulate, never deceive, never kill again. He remained in prison for nearly 2 decades. Those who knew him said he never showed remorse, never admitted to the full extent of his crimes. In 1999, he died behind bars, taking with him whatever secrets he had left. No more insurance payouts. No more carefully planned accidents. No more playing God with other people's lives. But the damage had already been done. The trail of destruction he left behind stretched across generations, families torn apart, lives forever changed by his greed. A man who could have lived an ordinary, successful life had instead chosen to build his wealth through betrayal and bloodshed. And for those who survived his schemes, his name would never be forgotten. The story of Dr. Glennon Engleman is not just a tale of crime, it is a chilling reflection of human nature, of greed without limits, of deception so deep that even those closest to him never suspected the truth. It makes you wonder, how many people go through life never realizing that someone they trust, someone they look up to, is capable of the unthinkable? How many times have we crossed paths with individuals who hide behind charm and professionalism, never knowing what truly lies beneath the surface? For decades, Engleman operated without suspicion, slipping in and out of people's lives, orchestrating deaths as if they were mere transactions. His victims weren't strangers, they were people he knew, people who trusted him, people who never saw the danger until it was too late. And that is perhaps the most disturbing part of this story. He didn't need a weapon in hand to kill. He used manipulation, persuasion, and careful planning. He convinced people to trust him, to believe in his intelligence, his charm, his authority. And when the moment was right, he struck. How many others like him exist in the world, blending in, wearing a mask, living two lives? It forces us to rethink the way we see people, the way we trust so easily, the way we assume that those in certain professions, those with titles, those with prestige, are beyond suspicion. But cases like this prove that sometimes, the most dangerous person isn't the one lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, they are in plain sight. This case also shows the persistence of investigators, the long, grueling process of seeking justice when a criminal has covered their tracks so well. For years, Engleman thought he was untouchable. He believed he had outsmarted everyone. And for a long time, he had. But no matter how well a crime is planned, no matter how deeply buried the truth may seem, it only takes one mistake, one person speaking up, one investigator refusing to give up, to bring it all crashing down. And yet, even with justice served, the victims remain gone, their lives stolen for nothing more than money and power. Their families live with the knowledge that someone they trusted, someone they might have once welcomed into their home, saw them as nothing more than a financial opportunity. No trial, no verdict, no prison sentence can change that. Stories like this leave us with unsettling questions. How many crimes remain unsolved because the perpetrator was too careful? How many people live with suspicions they are too afraid to voice? And most importantly, if faced with the truth about someone you trust, would you be able to see the warning signs, or would you dismiss them, just as so many did before it was too late? The story of Dr. Glennon Engleman is a reminder that the most dangerous people are not always the ones who look the part. Sometimes, they walk among us unnoticed, blending into society, wearing the mask of respectability. A dentist, a professional, a man trusted by his patients, his friends, even his lovers, yet beneath the surface, he was a cold, calculating predator who treated human lives as stepping stones to his own financial gain. The very people who believed they were safe in his presence were, in reality, his next targets. These crimes were not impulsive acts of rage or moments of weakness. They were planned, methodical, and carried out over decades with an eerie level of patience. Each murder served a purpose. Each victim had a role to play. Engleman did not kill for the thrill of violence but for money, an emotionless transaction, as if human life was something to be cashed in, as if trust and loyalty meant nothing. It is unsettling to think about how many people trusted him, how many unknowingly stood on the edge of danger, unaware that the man they spoke to, smiled at, and shared their lives with was already calculating what he stood to gain from their deaths. He was careful, precise, ensuring that no suspicion would fall on him. And for years, it worked. He knew how to manipulate the system, how to cover his tracks, how to create just enough distance from his crimes to avoid scrutiny. He was not the one pulling the trigger in every case, but his fingerprints were all over the plan, the motive, the outcome. He exploited the people around him, convincing them to play their parts in his schemes. Some did so willingly, enticed by the promise of wealth, while others were simply pawns, never realizing they were being used until it was too late. But no matter how well a lie is constructed, no matter how airtight a plan may seem, the truth has a way of surfacing. A pattern begins to form, connections are made, and questions arise that demand answers. Investigators, often underestimated, refuse to let go, refuse to accept that so many deaths could be coincidence. And all it takes is one misstep, one loose end, one person speaking out for the walls to start closing in. The case against Engleman was built piece by piece, a puzzle that had remained unsolved for too long, until finally, there was no way out. He had spent years orchestrating his crimes, but in the end, the only thing he secured for himself was a lifetime behind bars. Justice, in a way, was served, but it could never undo what had been done. The victims remained gone. Their families lived with the loss, the betrayal, the realization that someone they had once trusted had viewed them as disposable. No amount of time, no prison sentence, no punishment could change that reality. And so we are left with questions that linger long after the case is closed. How many others like him exist, living double lives, hiding behind their professions, their charm, their carefully crafted facades? How many crimes remain undetected because the perpetrator was too careful, too smart, too patient? How many people have trusted the wrong person, unaware of the danger until it was too late? These stories are unsettling, not just because of the crimes themselves, but because they force us to question the world around us. The people we trust, the systems we rely on, the assumptions we make about those who hold positions of power and respect. It is a sobering reminder that evil does not always look like what we expect. Sometimes, it smiles at you. Sometimes, it shakes your hand. Sometimes, it sits across from you in a perfectly ordinary room, discussing business, making promises, hiding its true nature in plain sight. Thank you for joining us in unraveling the disturbing story of Dr. Glennon Engleman. If you found this video insightful, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay updated with our latest true crime stories. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we examine another perplexing case that challenges perceptions and uncovers hidden truths.